Harley gambled its legacy on the V-Rod, and many riders say they paid for it in resale, upkeep, and support. Behind the scenes, Honda revealed the bike and uncovered brutal truths most people missed. That teardown-style review explained why V-Rod values lagged, ownership costs felt higher, and some dealers were frustrated supporting an outlier platform. If you ride a Harley, or plan to, what Honda found could save you thousands in the years ahead. Stay with me, because by the end, you'll know exactly how to spot the next motorcycle that looks bold on paper, but bleeds your wallet in reality. Radical breakthrough. Harley didn't just build a new bike, it risked tearing its own legacy apart. The company had spent nearly a century selling air-cooled V-twins that thumped and rumbled with unmistakable character. Then came a machine that ran hotter, spun faster, and looked like it had been sketched by a European design house. It was powered by the so-called Revolution engine, a liquid-cooled, double-overhead cam, 4-valve per-cylinder beast that owed its refinement to Porsche engineering. The collaboration was no marketing gimmick. Stuttgart engineers had been pulled in to take Harley's race-bred VR1000 motor and civilize it for mass production. The styling told the same story. A stretched wheelbase, low stance, massive rear tire, and polished aluminum frame lines made the V-Rod look more like a dragster than a touring cruiser. Even its fuel tank was disguised beneath the seat, with the traditional tank now serving as an airbox cover. To longtime Harley riders, it was a shock to the senses. Here was a machine that ran to nearly 9,000 revolutions per minute instead of loafing at half that. It could sprint in a way no other Harley had before, and it wore its muscle on its sleeve. For riders, the shock was real. The bike in your garage suddenly felt older overnight, like a relic of another era. Harley had dared to prove it could out-engineer itself, and that left loyal owners wondering if their classic machines were already yesterday's news. But what shocked the world even more was how Honda dissected it behind closed doors. If you're enjoying this breakdown so far, hit that like button. It tells me to keep digging into the stories nobody else is willing to cover. And drop a comment. Do you think Honda respected the V-Rod or secretly laughed at it? Honda's framework of judgment. Inside Honda's war rooms, rivals aren't just studied, they're dissected like enemies. Engineers and planners treat competitors as case studies, pulling them apart to understand what is bold, what is risky, and what is sustainable. When the V-Rod appeared, it was immediately logged into this system. Honda's evaluators used a two-pronged lens. On one side, they acknowledged innovation, noting the courage it took to introduce a high-revving liquid-cooled cruiser into a market built on tradition. On the other side, they weighed commercial suspicion, asking whether such a radical machine could actually win long-term acceptance. This framework was not unique to Harley. Honda had used the same approach when Kawasaki launched the Ninja, or when Yamaha pushed into adventure touring. But in this case, the exercise carried special weight, because Harley was not just another brand. It was the symbol of American motorcycling, and its choices influenced culture as much as engineering. To Honda's internal reviewers, the V-Rod looked like both an achievement and a gamble. They flagged its technical daring, but also placed question marks around the habits of riders who were used to low-revving torque and simple maintenance routines. If you've ever walked into a dealership and felt judged, imagine Honda doing it to entire brands. Their evaluation process wasn't abstract. It was ruthless math about what would cost you more at the pump, in service bays, or in resale value. Riders were the ultimate ledger, and when they turned that framework on the V-Rod, the respect was real, but so were the doubts. No matter what you ride, one thing stays true. The right gear makes the difference. My go-to gear and accessories are linked below in the description. Torque War. Every rider knows torque isn't just numbers, it's bragging rights at the stoplight. The Honda VTX 1800 was a torque giant, delivering effortless thrust from idle and rewarding riders with a laid-back surge that fit the classic cruiser mold. The Valkyrie, with its flat six layout, pushed the concept further, offering locomotive smoothness and mountains of low-end pull. Against that backdrop, the V-Rod felt like a different species. Instead of delivering its punch right off the line, it invited riders to spin the tachometer higher, leaning on horsepower rather than brute torque. On paper, this created fireworks. In practice, it meant two very different riding experiences. Honda's machines embodied the relaxed authority of long-distance muscle, while Harley's newcomer urged riders to twist the throttle deeper, chasing numbers in a way that echoed sport bike culture. The drag strip silhouette matched the intent: straight-line bursts and performance bravado. The comparison was not about which machine was stronger, but about how strength was delivered. Each brand's cruiser spoke to a different rhythm of the road, and the divide could be felt every time the light turned green. Every Harley or Honda rider knows the bragging starts before the helmets are on. Whose bike hits harder off the line? Whose torque can smoke the competition at a stoplight? For many, these debates weren't abstract. They determined pride at every weekend meetup. Yet Harley's boldest bike did not just clash with Honda on numbers, it clashed with its own DNA. Identity clash. The V-Rod didn't just split the market, it split Harley's own family of riders. Traditional Harley owners looked at its radiator and polished frame rails and felt betrayed. The familiar potato-potato rhythm was gone, replaced by a smoother, higher-pitched note that did not stir the same emotions. Riders who had waited years to buy into the Harley dream often walked past the V-Rod without a glance. At the same time, the younger crowd Harley had hoped to capture remained skeptical. If they wanted liquid-cooled performance, they could find it with Japanese or European bikes that carried stronger reputations in that space. The result was a machine trapped between two audiences, too radical for the faithful, not convincing enough for the newcomers. Marketing campaigns tried to bridge the gap with celebrity endorsements and drag strip imagery, but the dissonance lingered. The V-Rod became a paradox, celebrated for its boldness, yet isolated by the very culture it was meant to conquer. In motorcycle circles, debates about its looks and purpose often turned into debates about Harley's soul itself. If you rolled up on a V-Rod, the stares were unavoidable. Some admired it, others sneered. Riders felt judged for buying it, as though they'd betrayed a sacred code. Suddenly, your motorcycle wasn't just transportation, it was a referendum on who you were in the community. And that identity crisis was exactly where Honda saw the opening. Technical respect. Honda's analysts saw something shocking. Harley had built an engine even they had to admire. The Revolution engine stood apart from anything Harley-Davidson had attempted before. Double overhead cams, 4 valves per cylinder, and liquid cooling represented a leap forward, and Honda's analysts noted how the architecture allowed the motor to rev close to 9,000 revolutions per minute without self-destruction. To Japanese eyes, this was a serious piece of work, something built with a level of ambition Harley had rarely shown. The foresight on emissions was another point of admiration. Honda understood the coming tide of stricter regulations. They saw how the V-Rod's motor had space to adapt to tougher standards, a safety net that many air-cooled competitors lacked. The packaging choices, too, raised eyebrows. Relocating the fuel tank under the seat, disguising the airbox beneath a sculpted cover, and stretching the wheelbase to give drag strip stance were not just cosmetic tweaks. They showed a willingness to rethink fundamental design in a market where conservatism usually ruled. The Revolution engine didn't just impress engineers, it made riders question what they'd been settling for. Imagine pulling up next to a bike that revved higher, ran cleaner, and promised fewer breakdowns. Riders who had bet on old-school designs had to wonder if they'd already lost. Inside Honda, the message was clear. Harley had proven capable of more than nostalgia, but admiration was only half the story. The other half was brutal skepticism. Brand skepticism. But respect turned cold when they asked one brutal question. Does this bike even feel like a Harley? Harley-Davidson had built its empire on air-cooled thunder, on bikes that celebrated mechanical simplicity and an unmistakable sound. The V-Rod defied that identity. A radiator sat where chrome should have gleamed, the exhaust note was smoother, and the riding style demanded higher revs instead of laid-back torque. To Honda's evaluators, this was not just a product risk. It was a cultural fracture. They doubted whether Harley's faithful would embrace a machine that seemed to challenge the very rituals of ownership. Could a rider who spent years dreaming of the classic rumble suddenly fall in love with a near 9,000 RPM scream? Honda's answer was grim. They marked the V-Rod as a machine at war with its heritage, a bike trying to win outsiders without securing its insiders. In Honda's judgment, long-term loyalty was not built on rebellion against your own story. Harley purists felt it in their wallets too. Buy the wrong bike, and resale could collapse. Honda saw this clearly. A motorcycle that confused its own base meant long-term losses. Riders who ignored that risk discovered their investment was worth less the moment the next model year arrived. And while Harley wrestled with its image, Honda doubled down on its own doctrine. Honda's doctrine. Honda's secret weapon wasn't louder engines or flashier ads. It was the math writers never see coming. The company valued not only what happened on the open road, but what happened in the years after purchase. Service intervals, dealer training, and parts availability were mapped with military precision. To Honda, a motorcycle was not just a thrill machine, it was an ownership promise. This doctrine explained why Honda cruisers like the VTX or the Shadow could command repeat buyers. Riders knew that breakdowns were rare, that dealerships had the knowledge to keep machines humming, and that resale value held up because the brand was trusted. Honda planners believed these invisible advantages mattered more than headline-grabbing horsepower or radical styling. They were playing the long game, focusing on predictability and peace of mind. If you owned a Honda, you probably never had to budget for constant surprise repairs. That calm wasn't accidental. It was the result of decades of doctrine that turned ownership into a predictable, low-cost experience. Honda riders didn't just buy motorcycles, they bought peace of mind. So when Harley leaned into risk, Honda leaned into reliability and waited for the verdict. The sunset. When Harley pulled the plug in 2017, it wasn't just a death, it was confirmation. Harley-Davidson announced that the V-Rod line would be discontinued, ending a 15-year run that had begun with so much noise and ambition. Official explanations cited tightening emissions requirements and a shift in corporate focus, but inside the industry, the signal was clearer. The V-Rod had never become the cultural pillar it was intended to be. Sales never matched Harley's core models, and the cost of sustaining an outlier platform grew harder to justify. For Honda's evaluators, the discontinuation confirmed their original suspicion. A motorcycle can win engineering awards and still fail to survive if it does not align with its brand's identity and customer rituals. The V-Rod had proven Harley could build a technically impressive liquid-cooled machine, but it had also proven that boldness alone does not sustain a legacy. Ending the line was both a retreat and a lesson carved into corporate memory. When the V-Rod was discontinued, riders holding one in their garage felt the financial hit instantly. Resale values slipped, parts became harder to find, and support dwindled. The decision didn't just end a motorcycle line, it pulled money straight out of owners' pockets. But killing the V-Rod did not kill its DNA. It was just sleeping. DNA in the shadows. The V-Rod may be gone, but pieces of it are still hiding in Harley's newest machines. Over the years that followed, pieces of its technology began to reappear in quieter, less controversial forms. When Harley introduced liquid-cooled heads on select touring models in the 2000s, the engineering lineage traced straight back to the Revolution project. Even the decision to integrate more sophisticated fuel management systems carried echoes of the V-Rod's pioneering architecture. Harley could not ignore what the V-Rod had proven. Liquid cooling was not a betrayal of heritage. It was a survival tool in a world of increasingly strict emission standards. The V-Rod had simply been ahead of its time, introducing innovations before the audience was ready. By embedding its lessons into mainstream models, Harley salvaged value from the experiment. Engineers inside Milwaukee continued to mine the revolution's blueprints, proving that radical ideas, once tempered, could reinforce the brand rather than fracture it. Riders often don't realize that the innovations under their seats are recycled DNA. The V-Rod's fingerprints remain in Harley's newer machines. If you ride one today, part of what you rely on, liquid cooling or emissions performance, was tested years earlier in a bike most riders rejected. And while Harley carried the DNA forward, Honda sharpened its ownership edge, the ownership ledger. Ask any Honda rider why they stay loyal, and the answer is always the same. The bills never bite back. The Japanese manufacturer's real advantage was not always the bike in the showroom, but the ledger that followed the sale. Owners discovered that Hondas cost less to keep on the road year after year. Parts were widely available, mechanics were trained in consistent systems, and routine maintenance rarely turned into a wallet-draining surprise. This reliability translated into higher resale values, creating a cycle of loyalty. For riders comparing options, the numbers spoke louder than any advertising. A Honda Cruiser could hold its value years longer than a competitor, while service appointments felt predictable and affordable. The ecosystem around the machine reinforced the purchase decision, making ownership feel like a partnership rather than a gamble. Honda's focus on cost of ownership meant that when rivals took risks with radical products, buyers often retreated to the safer harbor of Honda's stability. It was not about flash or hype. It was about the comfort of knowing that the math would never turn against you. Ask yourself, how much have you really spent keeping your motorcycle alive? Honda riders discovered that their total bills stayed shockingly low compared to rivals. That long-term savings didn't just matter on spreadsheets. It meant more money left for road trips, upgrades, and even the next bike. But outside the numbers, culture was waging its own war on Harley's experiment. You've seen how deep this rivalry runs, and there's still more ahead. If you're serious about motorcycles, don't miss what comes next. Hit subscribe right now, because the next chapter could change how you see your own ride forever. Miss it, and you'll always be one step behind. Custom culture era. Television in the early 2000s rewired biker culture, and it left no room for pretenders. Shows like American Chopper turned fabrication into primetime drama, fueling a wave of custom culture that rewarded authenticity above all else. Builders with blowtorches and tempers captured audiences who equated raw steel and bare-knuckle work with the soul of motorcycling. In this climate, the V-Rod's sleek lines and Porsche-assisted engineering felt almost too polished. The bike's futuristic sheen clashed with an era that idolized rough edges and family feuds played out on camera. For many riders, authenticity meant tradition. They wanted machines that looked like they had been carved from the same mold used by generations before. The television boom hardened these expectations, broadcasting the idea that real bikers valued continuity, not reinvention. Against this backdrop, Harley's futuristic gamble seemed disconnected from the story unfolding on living room screens. While the V-Rod fought for credibility, custom culture painted a different picture of what counted as real. For riders, the impact of TV culture was brutal. If your bike didn't look authentic, you risked ridicule at the next meetup. Custom culture raised the bar for credibility, and that meant buying the wrong machine could make you invisible, or worse, a target for mockery. And from that cultural battlefield, Honda took one lesson Harley never mastered: Honda's quiet adoption. Honda learned from Harley's gamble, but they made one vow: never let innovation feel like betrayal. They noted how Harley had embraced liquid cooling early but stumbled in presenting it to customers. Honda chose a different path. Instead of forcing radical change overnight, they folded new technologies into familiar packages. Emissions-compliant engines appeared first in models that already carried strong reputations. Rollouts were sequenced carefully, with customer education and dealer preparation moving in lockstep. The lesson was simple: innovation without disruption. By the mid-2010s, Honda had introduced advanced cooling and fuel systems across multiple categories, but few riders felt blindsided. The company framed each update as an evolution, not a betrayal. Where Harley's V-Rod appeared to break with the past, Honda's lineup seemed to extend it. Behind the scenes, supply chains adjusted smoothly, ensuring parts availability and dealer readiness long before showroom launches. Honda had turned Harley's painful experiment into a blueprint for progress. Owners barely noticed Honda's transitions because they were seamless. That meant no nasty surprises in the service bay, no sudden plummet in resale value, no culture shock at rallies. Riders experienced the benefits of innovation without ever feeling betrayed, which is why Honda's adoption went down so smoothly. And what it meant was not just technical, it reshaped supply chains too. Supply chain fallout. Dealers dreaded the V-Rod, not because it didn't sell, but because it broke their playbook. Dealers had to stock parts that were not interchangeable with Harley's traditional platforms. Technicians needed special training to service a motor designed with Porsche's input, and that meant extra costs, extra classes, and occasional frustration when simple jobs required unfamiliar tools. Suppliers, too, felt the strain. Companies that had long produced components for air-cooled V-twins suddenly had to adapt to liquid cooling systems, different tolerances, and new materials. The result was a fragmented ecosystem. Some dealerships embraced the V-Rod and invested heavily, while others quietly avoided pushing it because every sale meant new complications. Even warranty claims became more complex, as the parts pipeline struggled to keep pace with demand for components not used anywhere else in Harley's lineup. For a brand that prided itself on dealer loyalty, the V-Rod created a hidden tax on relationships. Those who bore the burden felt it long after the showroom doors closed each night. If you owned a V-Rod, you felt the fallout directly. Parts were harder to find, service was slower, and bills piled up. Riders who expected Harley's legendary dealer network to protect them quickly realized they had bought into an outlier that strained the entire system. And the regulators waiting in the wings made things even harder. Regulations loaded dice. By the late 2000s, regulators stacked the deck, and air-cooled engines were marked for death. Governments were rolling out stricter rules on hydrocarbons, noise, and carbon output, and motorcycles could no longer hide from the spotlight. Liquid cooling was no longer optional. It was inevitable. Regulators were effectively loading the dice against air-cooled engines, forcing manufacturers to adopt systems that could maintain efficiency under pressure. For Harley, the V-Rod had foreshadowed this shift, yet its timing had been awkward, arriving before the majority of riders cared about regulatory compliance. By the time rules became unavoidable, the V-Rod was already fighting for relevance. Honda, however, tracked these developments with clinical precision. They monitored each phase of emissions legislation and scheduled model updates to meet the next bar just in time. Where Harley seemed forced into change, Honda appeared prepared, presenting compliance as natural evolution rather than reluctant surrender. Regulations don't just affect corporations, they strike directly at riders' wallets. A motorcycle that suddenly fails emission standards becomes harder to register, more expensive to repair or modify, and instantly worth less on resale. For everyday owners, these rules were never abstract political debates. They decided whether the bike in your garage could legally stay on the road, hold its long-term value, or quickly turn into a money-draining liability. And as regulators squeezed, investors began making their own ruthless calls. Wall Street's verdict: investors don't ride motorcycles, but their verdict can still wreck your resale value overnight. Investors looked at the V-Rod and saw uncertainty, a bike that required heavy investment, carried brand risk, and delivered uneven returns. That uncertainty translated into risk premiums, with analysts warning that Harley's strategy exposed it to identity whiplash. Consumers, too, sent their own signals. Resale values for the V-Rod trailed behind Harley's other models, reflecting buyer hesitation and weaker long-term confidence. Honda, by contrast, continued to project stability. Wall Street valued their predictability, and consumers rewarded them with higher resale figures. The lesson was stark. Financial markets did not only react to numbers, they reacted to coherence. A brand that confused its audience bled confidence, and that confidence was the real fuel behind future expansion. Harley had gambled on reinvention, but investors demanded continuity, not experiments that fractured loyalty. Honda's strategy always protected its riders. Choosing a Honda meant escaping the endless cycle of financial shocks that haunted so many other motorcycle brands. It guaranteed stronger resale values, dependable dealer support, and far fewer costly surprises. That stability was never just a corporate philosophy. It became a shield for ordinary owners. Thousands slept easier, confident the bike in their garage would not suddenly become a liability or drain their wallets. But the harshest judgment did not come from Wall Street. It came from Honda's final verdict. Honda's playbook. Honda's final lesson was ruthless. Steal the innovation, bury the risk, and own the road. The V-Rod proved that daring engineering could be admired even by rivals, but it also proved that betraying brand identity could be fatal. Honda's lesson was not to avoid innovation, far from it. Their approach became to fold innovation into a seamless narrative, never breaking the bond of reliability, never alienating the core rider, and never asking the supply chain to contort itself for one orphan product. In Honda's eyes, Harley had built a revolution without a roadmap, hoping the world would follow. Honda chose the opposite, to build roads that would lead customers naturally from the past into the future. Each advancement in emissions, performance, or design would arrive clothed in familiarity, introduced as an upgrade rather than a rupture. This was the ultimate conclusion of Honda's study. Innovation must serve continuity, not destroy it. Honda's strategy always protected its riders. Choosing a Honda meant escaping the cycle of sudden financial shocks that haunted so many rival brands. It guaranteed stronger resale values, dependable dealer support, and fewer breakdown surprises. That stability wasn't just a corporate philosophy, it was a shield for everyday owners. Thousands slept easier, confident the motorcycle in their garage would never turn into an unpredictable liability or drain their wallets overnight. Harley built a revolution with the V-Rod, but Honda's audit proved bold ideas don't always protect riders. The lesson is clear. A motorcycle that breaks its own story can break your wallet too. If this saved you money, hit like and subscribe. Next week, we rank the riskiest outlier platforms to avoid. Drop your take in the comments because I read everyone. And if you want more hidden stories the industry won't tell you, hit subscribe. The next breakdown could save your pride, your bike, and your money.